Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a project that brings together philosophy, developmental psychology, and comparative cognition to assess capacities for basic reflective thinking or basic reflective belief revision in 2-year-old children, dogs, and pigs. So many philosophers claim that non-linguistic subjects, such as very young children and non-human animals, cannot be considered rational because they lack the ability to reflect on and reevaluate their reasons for beliefs. So their suggestion is based on the idea that reflection is the defining feature of rationality and that is tied to language, because we typically reevaluate reasons by addressing why questions such as why does X believe that P, but suggesting that the ability to reply to these types of questions is necessary for rationality puts the threshold for doing so around the so-called age of reason, or between 5 and 7 years old. So this view struggles to account for human infants before they develop these linguistic abilities and altogether excludes non-human animals. By contrast, empirical researchers in developmental psychology and comparative cognition commonly accept and refer to non-linguistic subjects as rational. So in this study, we aim to build on the proposal that there is a thoroughly unreflective notion of rationality, of rational belief revision, and to do this, we developed a method to investigate whether subjects commonly thought to be unreflective by some philosophers may in fact be capable of basic forms of reflective thinking that do not require language. So unreflective rational belief revision occurs when subjects form and revise beliefs purely on the basis of relevant evidence, without any verbal or non-verbal explicit reasoning about it. And these unreflective responses can be in response to positive evidence or ordinary overriding evidence. So, for example, a response to positive evidence would be forming the belief that there are apples in the cupboard after seeing that there are apples there, while a response to overriding evidence could be when you go back to the cupboard to get an apple and you see no apples there. So you replace your original belief with its negation, there are no apples in the cupboard. So this second case is known as an overriding defeater. And epistemic defeaters are reasons against holding a belief. So a promising avenue for assessing the transition from unreflective to basic reflective thinking in non-linguistic and pre-linguistic subjects is through exploring how they respond to defeaters, specifically what's known as undermining defeaters. So what are undermining defeaters? While overriding defeaters suggest that you should replace your belief with its negation, so replacing the belief that there are apples in the cupboard with the belief there are no apples in the cupboard, undermining defeaters give you a reason to give up your belief or to reduce your confidence in it without suggesting that you should believe the negation. So typically, undermining defeaters work by suggesting that there was something wrong with how you formed a belief. So for example, if you discovered that someone had put a hallucinogenic pill into your morning coffee, then it might give you a reason to doubt that your perception was reliable the first time you looked in the cupboard and saw apples. Therefore, you've acquired an undermining defeater that suggests that the source of your evidence, in this case your perception, was unreliable. So responding to the suggestion that a source is unreliable demands that you disregard, or at least are suspicious of, the next piece of evidence that comes from that source. So what makes undermining defeaters especially interesting for studying the relation between unreflective and reflective belief revision is that they can be acquired by the generalization of responses to the overriding defeaters that were unreflective. So to try and explain this a little bit more clearly, imagine that you've just started a new job and you're getting to know your new colleagues. Over time, you notice that one of your new colleagues has made promises such as attending meetings or joining you for lunch or sending you some documents. But however, you discover that over time that they are not doing this and they're breaking their promises. And based on these experiences, you conclude that the colleague is not trustworthy. So therefore, you've acquired an undermining defeater, like the source is unreliable, from a series of these overriding defeaters, so failures to attend meetings, to join for lunch, and not sending documents. So rather than continuing to believe them, the next time that this colleague makes a promise, such as going for coffee, you will likely suspend judgment in response to the undermining defeater that you'd acquired. So experiencing several overriding defeaters coming from the same source might also lead non-linguistic subjects to acquire an undermining defeater such as the source of evidence is unreliable. And since the capacities to generalize and respond to overriding defeaters can be unreflective, it's possible that young children and animals may be able to engage in some basic reflective thought if they're able to acquire and respond to undermining defeaters. So to the best of our knowledge, no studies have so far engaged directly with the question of whether non-linguistic subjects can acquire and respond to the undermining defeaters, but there are several that have addressed questions about their capacity to identify and assess reasons. So research into social discourse and testimony, exploring how the children respond to information provided by others, has shown that even very young children preferentially use information from or follow the gaze of reliable over unreliable agents or sources. And dogs have also been found to be sensitive to the accuracy or reliability of informants and misleading evidence. More recently, researchers have started investigating the role of epistemic defeaters in explaining rational belief revision. So, for example, Madigan et al. Examined responses to overriding defeaters in 3 to 5-year-old children and grey apes, and Zsófia et al. Showed that 4 and 5-year-old children were more likely to revise their beliefs when presented with an undermining defeater that suggested that their reason for their belief was not justified than they were in response to positive evidence that supported their reasons for their belief. So while this study demonstrated that it is possible to assess undermining defeaters empirically, it tested older children using testimony as evidence, so we can't take from that whether undermining defeaters can be processed by non-linguistic subjects. So in our study, we aim to develop a method to investigate whether 2-year-old children, dogs or pigs, can identify and assess their reasons for belief by responding to undermining defeaters. And to do this, we explored whether they could infer the reliability of different sources of evidence by identifying the evidence coming from a particular source as misleading. So we ran the study with children at the University of Stirling in central Scotland, with dogs at the Clever Dog Lab in Vienna, and with pigs at Heidelhof Research Station in Austria. So using an object search task, we exposed these subjects to a series of trials in which they watched a human informant use an action to indicate one of 2 possible reward locations. Then they were allowed to choose where they wanted to search for the reward. So the experimental setup was kept as similar as possible across the 3 species. And at one end of the testing room, there was 2 opaque V-shaped screens that sat in front of a curtain, and they served as the 2 possible hiding locations. And we had 2 experimenters who played the roles of a reliable informant and an unreliable informant. And they wore different colored clothing to make it a little bit easier to differentiate between them. So the actions of the reliable informant always indicated the reward location, while the actions of the unreliable informant were independent of the reward location and were therefore sometimes misleading, and we set that to be 50% of the trials. So the task was designed to offer subjects the opportunity to make inferences about the reliability of the different informants over the repeated experiences with each of them. So the informants used 3 different actions to give subjects the opportunity to understand that different forms of evidence coming from the same source can also be misleading. And this puts subjects in the position to make a generalization about the misleadingness of the evidence provided by a particular source. So the first action that we used was crouching behind one of the screens, and you can see each of the subjects there, how it looked for each of the subjects there. The second action was lifting a container above one of the screens. And the final action was a sound that came from behind one of the screens while the informant stood in the middle and pretended to make the sound. So I've got a couple of example videos for the crouching and lifting trials for each species. The sound ones I didn't include because you can't tell where the sound is coming from in the videos. So hopefully they work. So first we've got a 2-year-old child here in a crouching trial with the reliable informant. So by following the evidence, which was the crouching action, she's found the reward. And then we've got an example of one of our dogs in a crouching trial with an unreliable informant. So because this was a misleading trial, the reward was covertly placed behind the alternative screen to where the action happened. So even though the dog follows the cue or the evidence, they don't find the reward, and they're not allowed to make a second choice. Okay, and finally, here's a lifting trial with one of our pigs. So the pigs are sitting at the bottom there. And again, in this trial, the informant is reliable, and the pig followed the evidence, so they found the reward. So how does this paradigm assess subjects' responses to undermining defeaters? So we were interested in subjects' willingness to follow the evidence provided by the informants, so meaning whether they chose the location where the informant acted or not. And we assumed that subjects would initially, in the crouching action, respond to positive evidence and choose the location where the informant acted, supporting a belief, something like a reward is behind the screen that the person acted on. But after experiencing the unreliable informant's misleading evidence, subjects were expected to respond to both positive evidence and overriding defeaters. So in misleading trials, when the unreliable informant's actions did not indicate the reward location, we expected that the subject would replace their belief a reward is behind the screen the person acted on with the belief a reward is not behind the screen the person acted on, after they found that the reward wasn't there. So each time this happens, they would be responding to an overriding defeater for their original belief. And we expected to see increasing suspicion in following the unreliable informant's evidence in the crouching trials, but because undermining defeaters are acquired via generalization over previously acquired overriding defeaters, it's not until the informant returned in a new context and used the lifting or the sound actions that we could then assess whether subjects recognize that the evidence coming from that informant may be misleading. And what we hoped to see was that, this is just the expected results, so we hoped to see that subjects would start to refuse following the evidence sometimes of the unreliable informant while continuing to follow the reliable informant throughout. So our final sample included 36 children, 39 dogs, and 21 pigs after exclusions, and we ran a binomial GLMM for subjects' evidence following, including fixed effects of informant, action, and species, and the interaction between them. And the analysis revealed that there wasn't a difference in subjects' evidence following between the reliable and unreliable informants, or any interactions involving the informant. What we did find was a significant two-way interaction between species and action. So this graph shows the probability of each species to follow the evidence, which is on the y-axis, across the three different actions, crouching, lifting, and sound, on the x-axis. And you can see here that, so the dogs are shown in green, the pigs in blue, and the children in red. And you can see that the pattern of evidence following across actions was different in the children compared to the dogs and pigs. And our post-hoc analysis showed that children became less likely to follow the indications of the informants in the later trials, and that this was significantly different to both dogs and pigs, but they weren't different to each other, as they were more likely to, or they continued to follow the cues of both informants at a similar rate to how they had initially, even though it decreased ever so slightly. So those results were averaged across both informants, but if we separate them out and look at them separately, we can see it's the same pattern for both the reliable and the unreliable informant. As well as looking at cue following across all of the trials with each informant, we looked at the subjects' responses on just the first trial with each informant in each action. However, again, we found no indication of any difference in evidence following between the reliable and unreliable informants. In this case, there was a significant decrease in evidence following across the actions, but that wasn't different between the species this time, though it's a much smaller sample size because of the trial numbers. So our results provide currently no evidence that 2-year-old children, dogs or pigs, made a generalization about the reliability of each informant across the actions. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that these populations don't have the capacity for basic reflective belief revision. And the species differences that we see in the pattern of evidence following across actions between children and the animals, we find particularly interesting. So why is it that children show a different pattern is our main question. So from the results, it's not possible to know what children took to be the source of the evidence. So although we set up the paradigm so that the informants were the sources of evidence and the evidence they provided was the actions, children didn't distinguish between the informants to view them as separate sources of evidence. Instead, their behavior suggests that they could have taken the informants together as a source of evidence, and the pattern of results kind of shows that in they were like along the lines of what we expected with the unreliable informant overall. Alternatively, they could have taken the task itself or the environment as a source of evidence, which again would show a very similar pattern if they had done that. And although these alternatives are not what we hoped subjects would consider as the source of evidence, their behavior could be explained perhaps by a response to an undermining defeater, such as the agents in this task are misleading, or the task itself is misleading. though we'll need to do some follow-up studies and further investigation to explore that further. So some other things to consider is whether the animals found the social aspects of the task engaging and were motivated enough by getting the rewards only some of the time. Therefore, sometimes not finding the reward might not have been a sufficient overriding defeater for them to acquire an undermining defeater. And finally, we might not have given subjects sufficient opportunity to acquire an undermining defeater, as it might require more trials and more overriding defeaters to differentiate between the informants. So overall, it's still an open question as to whether 2-year-olds, dogs and pigs are capable of basic forms of reflective belief revision. But the follow-up studies we're currently working on include exploring the level of feedback that adults need to process an undermining defeater in a very similarly structured task, and whether older children's performance on that task is related to their linguistic abilities. So I just want to quickly thank the rest of the project team and the funders, and thank you also for listening.
Thank you very much for this very exciting talk. Do we have questions?
Hi, thank you very much. I was wondering, you did not randomize the order of the kind of action, right? So the crouching was always the first action, so wouldn't you be concerned that maybe, for instance, for children, they are just more prone to following one kind of action, so that it's not anything to do with the undermining of their general beliefs about the agents, but rather that they find it easier to follow the crouching cue compared to the sound cue or something like that?
Yeah, so I agree that having the actions only in one order potentially could maybe explain some of the difference we see in children, but we had a reason for doing it, in the crouching, then lifting, then sound, because we wanted the action to become less associated with a particular side as we went along. So in the crouching, the whole body is going to one side during the action. In the lifting, it's just one small piece of the body, so one arm is going to one side. And in the sound, the person isn't moving. So that was our reasoning for having it set up like that. We did also include a pre-training for majority of the animals as well, to ensure that they were capable of following not one of the reliable or unreliable informants, but a different person in the crouching action. So we kind of set that baseline, and we excluded anyone who didn't have follow that person in 3 out of 4 trials in the first place. So we had a lot more subjects we tested that we didn't include in the final analysis. But it's something worth considering, like what order it could have been done in differently.
Up here. Hi. Nice talk, thank you very much. If I understood you correctly, then you used a within-subject design, where each subject saw a reliable and an unreliable agent acting. And I was wondering whether that might have led them to the impression that maybe this whole situation is unreliable, and whether you might think that it would be worth doing this as a between-subject design, where some subjects just see reliable agents and some subjects see just unreliable agents, and then you could see a clearer difference maybe. Yeah, so it was every subject saw both the reliable and the unreliable. That's correct. So a lot of research in the past has kept it separate, and we kind of wanted to avoid keeping it between subjects in terms of only seeing reliable or unreliable. But yeah, I agree, we can't exactly say what they were taking to be the source of the evidence, and perhaps exploring them separately, the reliable and unreliable, might be one way to kind of tease that apart. But I'm not completely sure it would show us what we're interested in just by looking at whether they can follow either a reliable person or if they just don't follow an unreliable person separately, because we wouldn't know how they would respond to them in a different situation. But definitely something to consider as a follow-up to try and tease this apart to see exactly what it is that's maybe going on differently with the children compared to the animals. Thank you. Okay.